today we will be discussing the last method under this travel cost, this rebuild preference method, that is the travel cost method. So, in the travel cost method, as you understand, it is one of these methods under this rebuild preference method. We will be discussing in detail that what is the background of the travel cost method, what are the origins, and what are the assumptions that we need to take into account, and also the dimensions and different types of travel costs and models that we need to discuss. So, under the types we will be discussing what is single site model under travel cost method, and what is multiple site model, and how we are going to estimate, how we need to model it, and also we will be talking about what is individual travel cost method and what is zonal travel cost method. So, based on the understanding of these typologies of travel cost method in general, we will be discussing what are the limitations, broad limitations of this method, and along with the recent developments in this method. So, let us understand the background of this method. As you understand, these rebuild preference methods are generally applicable to estimate the use value of the environment. TCM is also doing the same assignments, and moreover the TCM is used in estimating the willingness to pay, especially for the recreational demanded destination or the site where the recreational activities are performed. And again, the very premise of the travel cost method is that we need to take into account the value of the time and the travel cost expenses, and the value of the time and travel cost expenses, they are representing or they are the proxies for the price to access a particular recreational site. And when we are actually going to these underpinnings, the theoretical framework of this travel cost method, we need to take into account that this travel cost model is based on the application of the Baker's model of allocation of time. So, here we are talking about the Baker's model of allocation of time. So, in if you try to understand the Baker's model, so it was basically talking about a theory of allocation of time. So, he talked about this theory of allocation of time in 1965, and based on this understanding he tried to find out how the household times are being allocated and how it can be valued. In this recreational demand, we are also talking about this model of allocation of time, and here in allocation of time we are talking about the individual time constraint as well as the income constraints into account. And as you understand this travel cost, the very generic thing is that the travel cost is serving as a proxy for the price, right. And here how we are demanding or how we are estimating the willingness to pay, here the willingness to pay is estimated or it is based on the number of trips or number of times the visitors they visit and that particular site at different travel costs, maybe per year or maybe 5 years. So, taking into account this theoretical framework, the travel cost method or the framework has been modeled. But if you are going to the detail, so for the origin is concerned, we can go back to 1949 Harold Hoteling's times. So, for the first time Harold Hoteling, he produced a report to the National Park, US National Park Service and Recreational Planning Division stating what is the value of the recreational value of a national park. So, the report titled the economic study of the monetary valuation of recreation in the national parks, and from there the very travel cost method was originated, and it actually talked about the benefits that the visitors they are obtaining from using the recreational attributes from a national park. So, in a letter to the US Park Service, Hoteling suggested that we can use a model that is known as the travel cost model to analyze the benefits, how the visitors they are assigning and how the visitors they are getting the benefits from a national park. So, it is a kind of public policy he talked about in order to have a value of the national park service. And his report is based on certain intuitions. So, what are the intuitions of this travel cost method he talked about in 1949. So, for the first time he talked about that this travel cost method is based on common observation or intuition. The first one is that we need to travel to a particular site in order to have the recreation or in order to enjoy that particular site. So, the basic thing that the visitors they need to do is to travel. We need to travel. So, for traveling we need to incur certain costs. So, that is why the visitors need to pay a cost to reach the site. And the third intuitions he is making in the travel cost method is that when the traveler or visitor is spending his time and money to reach the site, so the number of visits he is making to that particular site, so it is actually displaying the lower bound of the value of the site for that individual. So, how many times a person is paying a visit to X site, right, in a year, it actually displays a lower bound of the value of that site for that person only. So, in this way we can actually make what is the value of a particular recreational site to different visitors. So, based on these intuitions, now for modeling this travel cost method, we need to have certain assumptions. So, what are the assumptions we need to take into account? The first thing that we need to take into account is that the cost of the travel and the time spent, both the travel cost expenditure that actually we are spending in terms of monetary units, and also the time we are spending that must be taken into account. And these two, the travel cost and the travel time, they are actually serving as the proxy for the value of the recreational experience the visitors are obtaining from respective recreational sites. And moreover, as you understand that reveal preference methods deals with the use value. So, here the use value can be analyzed, take into account the number of homogeneous visits to that particular site among the different visitors. So, what is this homogeneous visits? Because we are saying the assumption is that in travel cost method we need to take into account those number of visits which are said to be the homogeneous visits by the travelers or visitors. So, what is homogeneous visits? That means in case of homogeneous visits, we need to take into account the amount of time. So, that means if a particular individual or visitor is paying to a visit, let us say a recreational site for one day, he is spending one day, and second visitor is there, he is Y, and he is also spending that particular site, but he is spending at that particular site for let us say 5 days, right. So, in order to measure what is the value of that particular site, we cannot actually take into account their decisions or how these two visitors they are valuing the site. So, one is only staying over there in order to enjoy for one day, and another person is staying for 5 days. So, in that case it cannot be a homogeneous visits, rather than it is a heterogeneous visits. So, in order to estimate the value of this particular recreational site, we cannot actually mix the number of visits with respect to homogeneous visits and heterogeneous visits. So, we need to only take into account the homogeneous visits. So, whosoever is actually spending at this site for only one day, we are taking into account for our analysis only. So, we cannot mix one day with multiple days visit for modeling the travel costs here. And another assumptions that we need to take into account is the existence of weak complementarity between the environmental quality and demand for the environmental quality. So, what is weak complementarity? So, in general we say that in case of complementarity we need to understand that when the price of the first good increases, when the price of first good increases, if the demand for the second good decreases, right, then we are saying that there exists some kind of complementarity. So, example is that let us say sugar and coffee, right. So, it may happen that when the price of sugar is increasing, it may have impact on the demand for the coffee, because we generally take coffee with sugar. So, this is something like different. Nowadays sugarless coffees are being demanded, that is something different thing, but we are assuming that coffee is always demanded with sugar. So, in this case sugar and coffee can be the example of complementarity. But what is weak complementarity? So, weak complementarity can happen so when we do have a low cross price elasticity of demand. So, technically defined, when we are finding low cross price elasticity of demand or low cross elasticity of demand, then we are saying there exists weak complementarity. So, in this case we are taking into account weak complementarity between this environmental quality and demand goods. So, first of all understand what is this weak complementarity with respect to or which is technically defined as the low cross price elasticity of demand. So, here we can take into account, let us say the case of pizzas with ketchups, right. So, when and you understand that when the price of pizzas are increasing, in this case you are saying that the demand for ketchup can be decreased. So, if this is the case, then here in case of weak complementarity, it should happen that because we understand there exists some complementary relations. So, this will happen, but in case of these, if there is some relations that like that, this ketchup is also demanded for taking sandwich, right. So, in that case what will happen, although price of pizzas will be increasing, but it will not be its repercussion will not be reflected in the ketchup's demand, because this ketchup is also demanded for taking the sandwich, right. So, in this case the price of pizzas, increase in price of pizza may not reflect in the demand for ketchups, right. So, this is a case of the weak complementarity, although the complementarity relationship is existing between these two goods, but still it is a case of weak complementarity of goods. So, likewise in this case environmental quality and demand, we are assuming a weak complementarity, not a very high cross price elasticity of demand to exist. So, in this case we can assume that the environmental quality of the site, it can affect the number of visits to the site, but not very strongly. And this weak complementarity assumption, it can allow us to identify how the variation in the quality of an environmental good can affect the behavior of a particular person, right. That whether to visit, or if visiting is not actually a very stricter sense, it is not affected, then you can say whether how it is impacting the visit. Suppose say earlier when the quality of the environment it was very good, the frequency of visit is very high, right. So, maybe 10 times in a year the visitors were visiting, when the environmental quality let us say to a particular marine beach. So, when the quality of this marine beach is very good, then people used to visit often. But now we are saying that because the quality of this beach now has been degraded, that is why people may prefer to visit less, right. So, earlier if the average visitation rate is 10 times for a year, now it has decreased to only once. So, this is a case that the weak complementary assumption, it can identify how the variation in the quality of an environmental good, it can also affect the behavior of a person whether to visit or not to visit, and if they are visiting at all, then they may reduce or may increase their visitations. So, based on these assumptions, now we can talk about 3 dimensions of the travel cost model. So, first thing that we must understand that how demand is depending on the quality of the environmental good, right. So, let us say that if the environmental quality or even the water quality of a particular marine recreational spot is good, then the demand for this marine recreational spot will be increasing. Then the first thing that we are saying that the demand will be depending on the quality of the environmental good, and the second thing that we are also talking about that the very number and duration of trips during a period of time that must be considered may be per year, that how many times we are actually paying a visit. And the third one that we must take into account in the travel cost model is the treatment of the substitute sites. So, whether there is there any other alternative sites available to that particular site in discussions. So, when a visitor to a national park faces the choices of many so many alternatives like other national parks are also existing in that locality, then we need to actually take into account the substitute site for estimating the true value of this recreational value of that particular site in discussions. So, based on these dimensions, that what are the 3 dimensions that we must take into account in the travel cost method. So, here we can actually have a framework. So, for the typology of the travel cost method is concerned. So, we can divide this travel cost model broadly into 2 categories, the based on the sites of visits and based on the zone of origin. So, when you are talking about the travel cost methods based on the sites of visits, we can analyze the travel cost method in terms of single site model, that whether the visitors are paying a visit to a particular site or there are so many alternative sites existing. And the second one is multiple site or alternative sites. So, where the choice is available and the visitors may go for choice that which site to visit. So, based on this understanding, we can have our travel cost model framework. And the second category of the travel cost model can be based on the zone of origin. So, in terms of zone of origin, we can also discuss the travel cost method in terms of the individual travel cost method, where irrespective of the zone of origin, that from which zone the visitor is belonging, we can take into account the behavioral factors that are affecting the travel and number of travel of that particular individual. So, if it is so, it is known as the individual travel cost model. Likewise, in case of the zonal travel cost model, we are not talking about the individual travelers characteristics, rather than we are talking about the zonal characteristics of the travelers, that from which zone, from which locality the travelers are coming to a particular recreational site in discussions. So, now let us discuss the first one, that is single site model. So, in case of the single site model, as you understand, the demand for recreation of a particular visitor is estimated during a period. So, preferably a year or for 5 years. So, here the quantity demanded is nothing, but it is expressed in terms of the number of visits. How many times a particular visitor is visiting to that particular recreational sites in a year, whether 2 times, 5 times, 10 times or how many times. So, that is the demand the visitor is putting on that recreational spot. So, here take into account the same demand price relationship. So, as you understand that demand is a function of price, right. So, here if you are taking into account the demand as the number of visits, so now number of visits will be a function of the price. So, what will be the price for the number of visits? So, it will be in terms of the travel cost the visitors would be incurring during their travel. So, simply say that taking into account this price demand relationship, you can express this these functions that V equal to a function of TCV. So, that means that is number of sites the number of visits the visitor is paying a visit to this particular site depends upon the cost of this visit. So, here the very intuition that we are taking into account that if the visitors are living close to this site, then it has a low cost expenditure per visit. So, if the cost of visit is less, then obviously the person would be interested to pay more number of times to visit that particular place, and vice versa. That means, if a person is living away, very away from that particular site, then it is very likely that he or she would be paying less number of visit to that particular site in a year or in whatever the time duration in consideration. So, understanding this price demand relationship in case of this recreational destination, we can find out what are the factors affecting this number of visits. Why a visitor is visiting this particular site, let us say twice a year, and there are certain visitors they are paying a visit like 20 times in a year. So, what are the factors that can affect and that can explain this behavior of the number of visits of these visitors? So, here the literature in the travel cost model we explored, and we found that we can take into account certain variables in order to explain these behaviors. So, after getting into account all these variables into consideration, we can now say that the factors like, so here V equal to number of visits to that particular site. So, it can be affected by the variables like the income of the individuals, and the socio-demographic characteristics of the individuals, like what is the age of this particular person, or what is the marital status, or what is the gender, whether she is male or female, and what kind of experience she is having. So, we need to take into account this vector of socio-demographic characteristics of this person, which is represented by Z in addition to his or her income. Moreover, we need to take into account the travel cost to the substitute sites. So, if there is some alternative sites available and the visitor is only visiting to this particular site in considerations. So, apart from this, we need to take into account the travel cost expenditure, that what is the medium of conveyance he is taking, and what is the total cost he is incurring for visiting this place from the place of his residence. So, these factors are actually explaining that how many times the person would be paying a visit to this particular places. So, based on this understanding that what are the factors that can explain the behavior of this the visitors to visit the particular site, we can now estimate the well-being or consumers surplus, and also in terms of willingness to pay from this recreational demand. So, as you understand that if we can systematically represent this in terms of a diagrammatic representation. So, here in the horizontal axis x, we are representing the number of visits, and in the vertical axis we are measuring the travel cost in terms of monetary units, let us say in terms of rupees. So, in the previous slides what we have discussed? We have discussed the number of, this is a demand functions, number of visits is a function of all these variables. So, this demand function we have drawn, right. So, this is number of number of visits, so this demand, and this is the travel cost. So, based on this understanding that now this will be this function, this curve would be this functions. So, now based on the very principles of the microeconomics, what we can find? We can find that at R0 number of visits, the travel cost incurred is TCR0, right. So, based on this understanding that now TCR0 is the price for paying R0 times of or R0 number of visits to this particular site. So, now we can find out that if the price is this much 0 TCR0, then the total trip cost would be how much for visiting this R0 times to this particular site, then the trip cost would be this much, this area which is represented by B. But the visitor, he was actually willing to pay how much? This area plus this A area, right, for visiting the same R0 times of visit to this particular place. So, his willingness to pay now would be this area A plus B area. This is nothing plus but what we are saying, willingness to pay in order to recreate in that particular site. But what is consumer surplus here? So, consumer surplus is your willingness to pay minus what exactly you are paying. So, what exactly you are paying is in terms of spending, in terms of your travel cost. So, that is B, right. So, willingness to pay, that is A plus B minus B equal to your consumer surplus. So, this area, this triangle which is represented by A is your consumer surplus. Now, you can understand what is the choke price here. So, what is the choke price? The price at which the number of trips it will be reduced to 0. So, number of trips, so we are talking about this R0 number of trips. So, when this R0 number of trips will be reduced to 0, that will be falling back. So, if the price per visit would be, per our visit would be this much, right. So, at this price TCR, your number of visits would be reduced to 0, and that is why this TCR price is known as the choke price, where the visitors would not be interested to visit at all, because the travel costs or the total expenditure is too high. So, by explaining this, we can also find out the consumer surplus from the equation 1, from this demand function. So, here what we are doing, we are just taking into account the integration of these demand functions by taking into account this definite integration TCR0 to TCR from the choke price. So, if you are integrating these demand functions, right, and you are defining these limits from TCR0 to TCR, then this area is known as the consumer surplus. So, this is the case of your single site. Now, let us discuss about what happens in case of the multiple site. That means, the person is actually visiting a number of sites or number of similar sites. So, in case of this multiple sites, the demand for the recreation is a problem of choices, right. So, which destinations the visitor need to visit, and if this is a problem, then it can be solved by using the random utility model. So, you can just explore McFadden's theory, discrete theory. So, there you can actually find out that how to solve which destination to be visited based on this theoretical understanding of the random utility model. So, here what happens exactly, the choices are explained by explaining different characteristics and attributes of those sites, and we assume that the respondents will be choosing those sites that will be giving them the highest number of utility, right. Based on this understanding, this random utility model will be allowing us to analyze the very behavior of economic agents when they are facing a problem of choosing, or alternatives are be there, and when alternatives would be many, then which one is to be chosen. So, that is what this model will be helping us to analyze. So, based on the second categorization of travel cost method, that is whether it is the individual travel cost method or the zonal travel cost method. As you understand, in individual travel cost method, what we are taking into account, we are just taking into account the behavioral aspects of a particular individual traveler, that we have already discussed in terms of your single site model. So, the similar can be applied to the individual site in discussions. But in case of the zonal travel cost, we need to take into account the visitors from different zones, right. So, now the visitation rates can be determined by taking into account different zones around those around that particular recreational area, and we can identify the origin of the visitors. So, based on these identifications, we can also estimate the number of visitors per year from each zone of origins. So, whether people are visiting, let us say people are visiting this Covet National Park only from the northern region of India or southern region or western or eastern regions. So, based on this region analysis, we can actually divide their origin of visitors, and we can estimate the number of visitors per year from different zones. So, based on this understanding, we can also generate the demand functions. Then we can collect the data on visitation rates, that how many times from each of the zones from north, south, east or west they are travelling to this particular national park per year based on their travel costs and different characteristics of the zones. And then we can statistically determine that how the visitation rate is affected by the travel cost and other zonal characteristics, right. So, we can also take into account different admission fees or entry charges for the site, and we can also get the demand curve based on this different entry fees. So, we can say that if you are dividing these zones of origin of visitors into z number of zones, then what we are doing? We are naming this, that z stands for 1 to 3 up to z, right. Then we are the next task after grouping these visitors in terms of different zones, what we need to do is to find out the visitation rates. So, in visitation rates, as you understand that it will be affected or it will be influenced by certain variables. So, the visitation rates, it is we can find out by dividing the number of visitors, that is AZ with the population in each of the zones. So, by doing this exercise, we can find out the visitation rate from each of the zones. Then we need to take into account the entry fee, the travel cost, then we need to take into account what is the average income from each zones, and we need also the data set from the other socio-demographic characteristics of the zone. So, now based on this understanding, we found we can actually express this visitation rates in terms of these variables. After doing this exercise, we can find the demand for the visit. So, demand for this visit we can find out from this function itself, right. So, once we are doing this demand for the visit, we can actually find out what is the willingness to pay, then we can also find out what is the consumer surplus from these demand functions. So, now this is the whole of the understanding that how the travel cost model would be looking like and what are the different components that we must take into account. And now let us talk about what are the limitations of this travel cost model as one of the methods under this rebel preference category. So, the first limitations we are finding is that this is only this method can only be used in measuring the use value of the environment. So, this individual travel cost model, it is not actually taken into account the presence of substitute sites, because we understand that there may be some choices, and in that case this individual travel cost model, it is not successfully dealing this presence of substitute sites. Moreover, this travel cost model is having a narrow applicability because it is only applicable for using this for modeling this use values, and moreover it is requiring a large number of data set. As you understand, we need to take into account what is the income level, what is the socio demographic characteristics, then how many times the person is paying a visit to this national park, and what are the other costs he is incurring during this travel. So, we need to take into account a very large set of data in order to estimate this travel cost model. And moreover, we do have this problem of multi-purpose trips. So, what is multi-purpose trips? That means, when you suppose say you are actually paying to this national park, visit to this national park, and during the same trip also you have you met your friend, you are planning, you have already planned and you met your friend, or during this same trip you also plan to attend a marriage function of your cousin, right. So, that means that the very trip is the same trip, and there we are attending a function, you are meeting a friend, and you are also recreating in a national park. So, there we can actually, it is very difficult to find out. So, what is the true value of the travel cost that we are putting only for this recreational visit. And moreover, in literature of the travel cost, we are finding a very difficulty in evaluating the travel time. How to measure the time, that this is the time you are spending, let us say 12 hours you are spending in just in travel, and what is the value for this travel, how to measure it. So, there is a lot of controversy and debates ongoing in this travel time. And in addition to this, we have made some developments. So, the recent developments on this travel cost literature can be that we can now measure the change in the quality of recreational sites, and there have been certain innovations in the econometric analysis, recent advancements are there. And for example, we have developed that how to handle the on-site sample. That means, when the person is paying a visit to that site and you are taking into account his or her data, and you are sampling this particular person on site, then there are certain issues like you are saying the truncation problem will be there, then how to deal with this truncation problem. So, for this reason, we have developed certain econometric analysis that in truncation problem, when you are taking into account the on-site data, that means the how many times the visitor would be visiting. So, it would be certainly greater than 0, because this is the first time. When you are saying on-site, then obviously this is the first time, at least he may actually visit n number of time, but at least the visitor would be visiting just one. So, this problem would be there in case of when you are counting the number of times the visitor is visiting that particular site. And moreover, in recent developments also we are finding, we are integrating this stated preference method with travel cost method, that can also be useful in validating the results. So, these are the suggested readings that you must actually go through in order to understand this travel cost model as a basic. Thank you very much.